ask you some question. Even today, not all the pod-related feature, not every single thing's working on the Windows. So, what Javier suggests, I briefly read that cap, suggests is introduce a flag and to need the user to set it is the full domain name or not. So if of course we need to figure out it is work on the Windows or not. But my question it is if it's not work on the Windows or it is not compatible workers is acceptable. We document this one. This is only limited to the pod or container running on the Linux box. I thought we agree in the past we want to largely converging, but given current situations, not all all the feature is converging on for support the Windows container and the Windows pod. So I just want to ask you: did we change that perspective?
With Docker EE, for a couple of different reasons, it's been very hard to get any sort of changes around Windows containers pushed into the Docker EE runtime. So we've been taking the approach with documenting it and wherever possible trying to add switches to make sure that, like, if it is a feature that can't run on Windows, that it runs on that users can either configure it or that acceptable behavior works on Windows. As we're working towards adding Containerd support, we'll have a lot more opportunities to change parts of the stack for creating the Windows containers and sandboxes. And we're hoping to close a lot of those parity gaps.
That's good.
Thanks, Mark. That was exactly what I unmuted and then remuted. I was going to say mostly the same thing. There's a big difference between it doesn't work and it can't work.
Yep.
So in Windows, when you are trying to launch a pod, a Linux container, you need the Hyper-V. Do you know how that stack work? Like in passing by the hostname field of the kernel?
I don't. Currently, we're saying running Linux containers on Windows nodes is kind of out of scope for the work we're doing with Containerd and Hyper-V isolation. We're focusing on just supporting running different OS versions of Windows or containers targeting different OS versions of Windows on those nodes. We'd have to look into that, and I'd probably need to pull some people.
Okay. So I think like if your scope is Windows, that's fine. We can target that for now and keep iterating later on.
Yeah.
So one thing about this feature that we have is like right now, like because the host field of the kernel is limited to 64 bytes. If you try to create like a pod that has an FQDN longer than 63 bytes. With the current approach, the current code I have, will create a container and it will stay in container creating forever. It just will log events saying, hey, your pod is FQDN is longer than 63 bytes. We cannot create a sandbox because that way it's a nicer message that failing underneath when Docker tries to do that. So I think like this proposal is mostly to set the mechanisms. I'm not sure or through the discussions that we had so far, we couldn't come up with a good solution for this. Like there are several ideas. Like one is like we do nothing and let it for whoever wants to use this feature to create an admission controller that will control this for them. This seems to be like Kubernetes kind of current approach seems to be like hey, let's use admission controllers like the webhook ones to make sure users don't do silly things or we control our users better. Another approach is create an admission plugin, but that will have to cover all the basics from the top layer and kind of like break the the different layers, right? We have to make assumptions about the underneath layers. If, for example, you want to reject the creation of a deployment based on this, which is not so great. And another way that it came out during the SIG network discussion was like if we can have like the node allow us to set, hey, this type of error is not retriable, and then the pod change into error or failed state, then that would be also much nicer than the current thing about the pod state container created forever. So I don't know if there are thoughts in this regard of in the signal, like what you guys think.
I'm sorry, I'm just reading your KEP for the first time, so I'm not as far on the questions as you might be on wanting to get answers. So just the current behavior for fully qualified domain names is basically your default DNS name as your pod name, and then you can give an optional subdomain on the existing pod spec. So your KEP here is adding a boolean that does what with existing?
So if you set this field, this boolean, it will set the whole FQDN into the hostname field of the kernel. Like so when you execute hostname or uname-n, you get the FQDN rather than the short name.
To be clear, this is a Red Hat-ism from long ago, right?
I'm just trying to, I'm not questioning any of it, Tim. I guess I'm trying to map story 1, story 2, story 3 in the KEP. And story 1 was, I get foo back, I didn't set this field. Story 2 said, I set the name and the subdomain, didn't set the field, but I still got the same FQDN as story 3. And so that's what I'm getting confused on.
So there's a difference between hostname and hostname-f.
Both say hostname-f-QDN returns the same result. So that's what I was just getting confused.
Yeah, hostname-f will always do the right thing. It does the right thing today, and it'll do the right thing. I think the problem here is that there's a body of users who assumed that hostname without the -f would give them the FQDN. And that's true on some distributions and not true on Kubernetes.
Okay. I trust everything you're saying, Tim. I was just trying to understand why I was being slow to understand why story 2 and story 3 had the same input or output.
No sweat. I mean, I've been staring at this for a couple of weeks, and to be clear, I actually really hate this feature. I just don't have anything that I could do that would be better, and it feels like a concession to compatibility with existing software.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I can work to try to make the user stories more clear. I think it's probably my fault on the narrative.
So for your other question, though, it was the error case was what that you were working through then?
So the error case, as I have it right now, I basically check if the FQDN is longer than 63 bytes, and if it is, I just return an error. And that shows, like, if you go a little bit down after the user stories, you will see how when the pod stays in container creating, and then like when you do describe the pod, you will see errors saying failed to create the sandbox, the FQDN is longer than 63 characters. That's currently like what I've seen, like today, like Kubernetes has different ways of handling this. Like you create a very long pod, like it will truncate the pod name to set the host name. If you create a deployment that is, well, you cannot create a deployment longer than 63 bytes, but you can create a deployment that is 60, and then what the replica set and for the pod adds will go over 63. So it seems that there is a different way of generating the pod names when this situation is hit.
Is that right? If I created a deployment whose name was 63 characters, will it actually be able to create a replica set? I would assume it would just fail to create the RS.
So I created one with 60 characters. It created a replica set by adding like dash and a bunch of stuff. And then the pod, it reserved itself the five characters. So it removed it removed 2 characters from my deployment name, and then it add 5 random characters to the pod name. So it was a bit strange. I wouldn't. I didn't
Okay,
expect
that's
that.
not what I would have expected, but okay.
Yeah, it seems like so that's the main thing. Like I don't know if we should try to attempt to solve this, or like we can make clear on the documentation that saying, hey, if you are doing that, you may hit this. Like maybe you want to do this a mission controller, and maybe we can even share the code of the mission controller for people to just copy it.
Yeah, I mean, there really isn't a good answer here that crosses across all those different layers, right? This is fundamentally the problem with the error handling in this sort of a patch. Like there isn't a good answer, short of every controller publishing how many characters it's going to add to the end, so that at the top of the stack you can subtract and subtract and subtract. But blah.
Yeah. So and what about like the making some type of error not retrievable? Like, do we have a sense of how hard is that from the kubeless perspective? Because right now I will try to create a sandbox forever.
Yeah, in general, like I've come to terms with the idea that Kubernetes is a controller that just keeps on trying. And as long as we give the response that we're not succeeding, I've come to accept that computers are there to run CPU cycles, and it's okay to keep trying. Maybe I've been playing in Cube too long.
The problem with marking it as permanently failed on one node is that the replica set's just going to try to create it on another node, right?
Oh, that's right.
So like you have to do that all the way up all the layers again. So I kind of lean towards what Derek is saying. You're not actually going to get much better. I think that the most important part is to surface it in the most obvious place possible, which is probably the pod, honestly, right?
Yeah, I think that's much better than trying to kill it on a replica set, because many users are not aware that there is a replica set there. So the other thing is like when I was filling out the KEP, I couldn't it's asking for a metric. Like, do you guys know what a good metric would be for this?
So I think we can help update the contents of the KEP if this is your first journey through the KEP process.
Yeah.
And so some of the questions may or may not apply. I think looking at the KEP roughly here, like we have to ask ourselves if this requires a feature gate and all the other things that go along with changing the pod spec. But
yeah, so I know the KEP or the readiness, production readiness folks just added a bunch of stuff to the KEP template, so that's probably where the metrics are coming. But I think it's reasonable, like a metric here of how many times this is failing is actually a useful metric, right? Having an alert that said, hey, I've got pods that are failing in this particular mode seems useful. And from an API point of view, I think we have come to terms with the idea that adding any new API field requires a gate for one release. Otherwise, you can't roll back. Jordan has beaten that into me.
Yeah, so
there's a question of
when looking at your implementation, PR, just like basically, I didn't know how much you wanted to go through this on the call here, but I don't have any objections to the idea. I don't know if there's any downsides that others have thought about that maybe we didn't think through. But the need makes sense to me.
Cool. Yeah, so the current implementation I share is like using like a kubelet flag, but it was brought to my attention that maybe using like a pod spec field is much more flexible and nicer to integrate with and to offer for things like GKE, so they don't have to sustain like more changes. So Yeah, so I will just need to change that to make sure that we propagate the field from the pod into down there. But I think the basic changes on the pod sandbox and into the container, I think they are there in the runtime, right?
Yeah, and it didn't look like your current prototype required any CRI changes to achieve this. I was just also trying to look at that if we had to call that out.
Yeah, I'm not very sure how all these different things work. I basically was looking for host name and putting it. Also, like this is a patch that we have internally in our company already, and we had since the beginning of that we were using Kubernetes. So, but we use Docker, right? So that's why, like, if you guys have advice on things that I may have missed, that would be great. Like the CRI that you're mentioning, and like other kube runtimes that I may not be aware of, like the ones that GK use, like I think use the Google Stack, right? Like the Virtio and stuff.
Okay.
A long time back, I hacked on Docker a little bit in this area, so I have some confidence that it's going to do the right thing.
Okay, nice. Okay, so
all right, I think you got the outcome you were looking for, right?
Yeah, I think that's good. Thanks a lot. So the next step is like getting this kept approved, right?
We'll need somebody to sign up for being a reviewer and an approver. Any volunteers?
I'm happy to do it. I have a kid emergency that just shoved something in their ear. I'll be back in a few minutes. Someone else needs to run this call. Sorry, guys.
I wish I
This
could
is
say
Mark.
I've
I
never
can
had that.
either volunteer to review or find a reviewer for this, especially for the Windows related behavior.
That's great, Mark. Okay, great. Yeah.
So Mark, I will add you as a reviewer and like approver. Like, do we add like Don, or you want to be approver?
Sure. Yeah.
So I can do this
This-
with. Yeah. Sorry.
I want to say like I disagree with Tim the using that as the opt-in nature of the feature as the standard to accept changes to the top level API.
It's not the only standard.
I want to just say that because that could be sacrifice our usability, because many customers already complain those kind of things, combination of the opt-in or opt-out, it is the maybe sacrifice of the usability. So I think the reason we accept this one, it is just because it's reasonable request, and also to support existing application. I think that's the key part here.
Thank you for clarifying what I meant. I've got to drop off, but Don, you said it, what I really meant. If this had been anything less than opt-in, it would have been a lot harder to justify.
That's so true. Yes. Yeah, because we don't want those arbitrary opt-in feature to get into our top level API. That's kind of we try to hold that standard. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank Vinay for letting me the first spot today.
Oh, no worries.
So let's move to next one, and and while waiting for the Derek, and sorry because I have the problem with my sound maybe. So next one, like the Vinay, do you want to move forward?
Yeah, this is going to be fairly quick. Can I share my screen?
Yes, let me grant you the. Somehow.
Yeah, it says host attendee has disabled screen sharing when I try to share.
Hey guys, I'm sorry about that. I had a weird family emergency. That's co-host.
Yeah. So Derek, can you grant Vinay about the co-host? Somehow I couldn't do today.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead, Vinay.
we go. Step 1. Okay, can you see the screen? Can everyone see the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So, okay, what I think the nutshell is, as I was implementing the kubelet part of it, so I did the API part of it, and I think both Tim and David had a look at it and gave me some feedback on it. Thank you very much. The next part that I'm working on, before I send the PRs to upstream code in quick succession, first the API, and then a few days later, I want to send the kubelet code. I just want to have it ready for that. And as I was implementing the kubelet, I came upon one issue. So what we do is we look at the API server. The watch tells us that the user desires a new sizing for the pod, which is okay, the CPU or memory has changed. And then kubelet looks at that, and then first step, it sees that there is a fit, the new requested desired sizes fit in the node. And if it does, then it approves that and then does the request resources allocated update, which is a patch to the API server. The next step is to update the limits if required. And that goes through update container resources CRI API. And now we have the resources field is also in the container status to inform the user, okay, this is the new requests applicable to the pod, the reservation, and then these are the new limits that are enforced on the pod or the container of the pod. One thing I've discovered while going through this, especially implementing the Docker Shim side of Docker Shim Docker side of the API on the client side, there is a way to query the memory. The stats gives me the memory limit in bytes, that field that goes in the C group, but there is no way that I could find to query the CPU CFS quota, for example, CPU shares, those three fields from the C group. And this kind of got me thinking, okay, if there is another implementation, maybe containerd, I'm just taking it as an example here. As of today, they're not implementing the API, but once they implement it, I expect them to return both all the three CPU fields in the Linux container resources and the memory field. So this comes from the extension we made to the CRI API, which is, let me escape this. This is a CRI KEP that we decided, okay, we're going to extend update container resources to carry the support for Windows as well. Today it has Linux container resources. And then we extend the container status API to return container resources, which is going to give us the memory and CPU information. This is the actual information, actual limits that are applied for the CPU and memory settings in the CRI in the runtime. And that's what we would ideally like to report to the user in our container status resources field. My question is—
That's a question, Vinay, sorry. I can't remember in our last discussion, but does this change what the error response is intended to be to this operation? Like, I thought in the past that if I tried to update the resources and the update couldn't be applied, that the CRI provider would error out.
Yeah, if they error out, if we send, let's say we call update container resources and we give it new limits and they error out, then we keep trying. We don't report that we have updated it in our container status. But the question is, let's say it succeeds. There are two ways to go about it. One is we can assume that both limits were configured. The memory and CPU limits that we applied is configured, and we go with that. The ideal way is to query this information from the CRI, which is the container status message. So let's say kubelet were to restart. It's got to discover this information. And the best way to do that is get it from the CRI. If that is not available, then we can do update container resources in what the spec tells us the limit should be. And if it succeeds, we report that. That seems to be the viable path at this point. because I don't see a way we can get this information if the CRI is not supporting it. But the issue is with Docker Shim. As I was implementing this in Docker Shim support to return the information, I found that there's no API on the Docker API side to query unless I go around the Docker API and read the C group information directly from the hard disk, which I don't want to do, from the file system, C group file system, which I don't want to do. I have partial information, like the memory limits is there, but I don't have the CPU information. So on the kubelet side, how do we handle this? That's kind of, let's say the CRI does not yet support it. It's coming, but it doesn't support it. The containerd doesn't support it today, but tomorrow they're going to have it. So if they return zeros, can we assume that it's not supported? Like in this case, I'm finding myself returning the memory limit information, but not the CPU information. So
Okay.
the options that I was looking at is potentially add a flag. 1 second here. So one option is to assume that 0 means no information has been returned, and then we publish the information that we got from the last. If the container was created, then we can assume that the limits that we initially set is the limits that we are using. And if the kubelet restarted, we call an update container resources. And if that succeeds, then we set the limits from that. So we don't rely on container status unless we have that information set from the CRI when it gives us the container response, the container resources response. So my question.
I'm confused a little bit. I'm sorry if it's okay.
Sure.
To me, if the kubelet says to update container resources and the resources can't be applied, then the kubelet won't assume the update happened. It's still not clear to me why container status is needed there. And then for the other thought I have here is generally like, as this gets rolled out, I'm assuming it's the responsibility of the individual that is configuring their cluster to ensure that their runtime of choice has the capability needed. Like I don't want to spend too long trying to think about ways of working around when a runtime doesn't have a capability versus just, like let's not turn that feature on. Let's not turn that feature on that environment.
Okay, so when we roll this out, let's say in 119, we get there and then we have this feature in alpha and people try it out. The container, the CRI is maybe Docker Shim is there, but other CRIs are not there, and Docker Shim is returning only memory information because I don't have a way to get Docker API to give me the CPU information. What's the best way we can do to handle this? And I understand if I
would just fail startup the kubelet with this feature enabled if Docker Shim is the configured CRI.
Oh, you'd fail kubelet startup? You just you have to have the feature enabled?
I don't know. There's a lot of options you can do, but like in general, like I'm trying to think through like at the end of the day, like I try to think about Docker Shim as if it's like any other CRI author, right? And
right.
I know others were exploring that, and if containerd or CRI-O or any other CRI that author return an error because they didn't get something done, like I'm wondering how much better we can do in the kubelet. Maybe I'm missing something.
The option that we have in the kubelet is let's say we create the container today. We assume that the limits are what we asked it to be asked of it. So we set the Linux container resources field and then send it, okay, create container and then start container. We assume that it started with those limits. And the extension we are doing with container status is that getting that information back from the horse's mouth, which is like, okay, when I query this, let me know what the limits that are configured at this point of time. So you're saying that, yeah.
So basically, what do you want? You want like the whatever container runtime at this status and return what it is on host, like the real state, right? So the host for this particular C group, what's the configuration? Is that true? Read from the real
Yes.
state.
Yes.
Okay. So in that case, I think that's pretty straightforward, if I understand correctly. So if it's the 0, it's basically no matter the CPU and the memory in kernel, you cannot set to 0, right? So
Yes,
if it's
exactly.
0, and then basically it is just this feature, you could just safely assume this is not the CRI client, whatever you are using underneath, don't support properly read the host information, and also at the same time we fix that problem in CRI. Is that okay?
I think so. So that was the assumption that I was trying to make, which I was unsure about, which is the question I had here. So if we get back 0, can we assume that the CRI does not support it, and we fall back to a second option that we have? Derek is kind of suggesting that if we don't have that, we should fail the kubelet start. That's also a reasonable way. I didn't think of that, but that could also be one way.
Can I make a few comments?
What can Derek, can you elaborate what's the field Kubernetes? With Kubernetes, I don't think about the we want Kubernetes crash, right? So
no, I apologize. By the way, I feel like I'm living Groundhog Day, so my memory is failing me with weird things happening at my house with kids sticking things in
I'm
their
cutting
ear.
out for everyone else as well.
What I'm struggling with is just this was a new feature gate to support updating container resources, and so there was an option that said we could say that if this feature gate's enabled and the container runtime configured as Docker shim, then we just don't start the kubelet, right? And that's one of the reasons why the feature would still be in alpha, right? That's all I was suggesting.
Oh, okay. Okay, my thought was if Docker shim does not support this container status, the new extension that we did, adding container resources, then we can work around Docker shim is in kubelet, so we can do something to fix that. But another CRI that doesn't support it, how do we handle that? So we are sorry about that. Yeah, so I was wondering how we can support a CRI that doesn't, if we get, I'm assuming that we get 0 information back, like memory limit is set to 0, CPU, these are 0. Can they ever be 0 in the kernel? Probably not.
So you can have 0 for CPU shares, right?
I don't know. Behind the kernel, in the past, actually you cannot set that to 0. Kernel will round it to some minimum value. So I'm not sure right now, the latest kernel, so someone maybe can quickly validate that.
Yeah, I think it becomes 2, I think. And it's not just CPU shares, there's CPU period and the 2 other fields in there, CPU quota. And the CPU period cannot be 0. So if we get that 0, can we assume?
I basically think about all the resource C group limit by design should be 0. So if it's 0, kernel will round it to some value. So since this is returned to what we read from C group, and for the real host, then the 0 means something it is not supported. But another thing is I want to mention that I want to bring this up because last year we did talk about the deprecate of the Docker shim and switch to using other container runtime. At least it's not have the Docker shim the built-in in all tree, like the in tree things. And so I think that also like I just saw that Alexander also brought this up. Yeah, this is so maybe you can focus more on the other CRI compatible. Just make sure the CRI and just make this is a problem and document this problem, and then the CRI owner can fix that problem.
Okay, I'm gonna do the fallback in the code and then go with what update container resources set is as the last known good value. In case of kubelet restart, we just do it again. I think that's one of the corner cases that I was looking into. It'll become a lot easier when I send out the code review to see this particular one. I'll call it out in the code review. David, hopefully you have context of it from the discussion today. So
yep. Yeah, I guess the one thing I just wanted to clarify though is like, when should the CRI author error? Do they error if they can't apply the resources, or do they error if they've applied the resources, but the actual resources applied didn't map the user's requests? Like, what is there an error here?
They can do it in both cases. So it's a CRI implementation specific detail. Let's say they're trying to configure in the case of C groups, they're trying to write to the file and that fails. That's an error. And if they did write to the file and they see that they have a way of detecting that the limits are not being applied, that's an error. So that's in either case when update container resources goes, we get back some status, which is success or failure. And if they can tell us at that point, then we'll assume that it's not been applied and we'll keep retrying.
So we'll fail immediately, right? We'll fail immediately when we try to write, right? What's the other scenario? I didn't get that.
So what I'm trying to figure out is like, if I do a memory limit that can't be applied because the actual memory in use is higher than that limit, the CRI is going to apply a value, but is the expectation that the CRI provider is then reading back the value to make sure it matched what you had specified, could not have been applied? Should they return an error, or should they return a non-error and just the latest resources that are read back from the kernel itself?
Well, reading is not always an option because you might have a VM-based runtime. So like with container D or CRI-FA itself, it's not able to read something from inside VM. The bigger question actually, what happens if a runtime is partially applied the resources? So I don't know what is the behavior of, for example, runc if you update container resources for, let's say, like 5 parameters and only one was really applied.
Yeah, so that partial use case is like the one I was trying to call out here, right? Are we expecting a CRI author to error if they can't fully apply? That they should never error if they've made a write, and that it's the cable's responsibility to.
I can clarify this a little bit. From the kubelet side, we're gonna. Sorry, there's an echo here. From the kubelet side, what we see is that if we have both CPU and memory being updated, we only do it one at a time. So they can say, okay, I got the CRI will not run into a situation where they applied memory and could not apply the CPU limits for a particular resource. And the reason I need to split it out that way is a user could be increasing the memory and decreasing the CPU at the same time. And
I don't understand why that split mattered, honestly, but like as an interface, nothing about the CRI operation for update container resources says we only make one resource update at a time. And so
we should just say that if they cannot do both, let's say we ask them to do both and they can't do both, they should fail both. They should fail the update and then we'll retry it.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to think, like, this operation is going to exist for a long time into the future, right? And so like there'll be other resources that we'll want to update in the future beyond CPU and memory.
Yeah.
And so like, I'm just trying to clarify what we think the behavior of this should be. And my current understanding of the behavior was that if the update couldn't be applied, then the CRI author returns an error.
Right. if the update is not cannot be fully applied, they should return an error. Actually, we should keep it that way. And when we send an update from our side, of course, we are only updating one resource at a time. And there is a good reason for me to do that, which is I need to order the resizing so that we're, let's say the overall limit is changing. Let's say you're increasing the CPU. The first thing I do is increase the pod level C group, and then go and increase the individual containers I sort it so that I do the decreases first and then the increases, so that I don't at any point of time exceed the pod level C group. And I can only do that if there are multiple types of resources being updated, like CPU, memory, and something else tomorrow. I can handle one resource at a time. So we could say that, you know, we could say you will not be asked to change more than one resource at a time, which is what we're going to do. But I'd like to keep that closer to our chest for now and say, okay, if you are asked to update more than one resource, and if any of them fails from your point of view, you just tell me I can't do it. The whole thing is failed, even though you updated partially.
Would you want to roll back or no?
No, rollback would risk, like, okay, if the update failed for some reason, there's a good chance that rollback could also fail. So the best thing to do is, the most robust thing to do here is to just, okay, you failed. I'm just going to keep trying until we get there.
Sorry,
so,
can I ask something about
sure.
this interface design? Because this is an interface design problem. So why don't we do so that we are changing the response from the container update container resources, so that after this protocol change, it will have a new field. So when you update it, the container runtime will read out the current value for all the resources, and it will return it in the reply. So in the case of a partial failure, you will get back what is the current situation. So we will not force the CRI to choose between either a rollback or a non-rollback, and leave the caller in an unknown situation that what is the current state.
We have container status for that. We're extending container status.
Yeah,
so,
but I'm talking about the reply, the response to this request. So why don't we also add the updated values that are read out from C group to the response?
Sure,
it's a backward compatible change. It will not break any API, and I think it solves most of your problems.
Well, we could do that. It still doesn't answer the question of whether the overall response status should be pass or fail. I don't think we have a response status that, or we would want to have a response status that says sort of passed.
Yeah, well, you can say fail and then give their values, though.
Yeah, certainly we can return the current state in the response. I'm all open to that. We added container status for that reason, extended container status for that reason. Essentially, okay, we can query it. So once we do this, we'll query it, and then and this is kind of what I'm doing here. I query the current, I call update container resources, then I call container status, I get back the current information and update the PLEG cache, which propagates over to status, the V1 API status.
This is the same way. I think in general, I'm +1 on seeing container resources returned in container status. So I was just trying to figure out the semantics on the update request, that's all.
Yeah, I think that we had discussed a while back, whether we wanted the update response, and then we figured, okay, since we're going to be querying anyways, let's say kubelet were to restart, and to populate the status, it needs to discover the information currently on the node through observations. So we need that extension for status. So adding it to the response of update container resources is a nice to have, but it's not gonna hinder this implementation if it weren't there. Does that answer your question, Christian?
Sure. Okay. So I think what you should do is that if you cannot just update everything atomically, you should fail, and then if you return in the response the current resource state, then you leave it up to the caller what it will do. So I think, so that's what I would do in this kind of API. That's why I brought this up. But yeah, you answered my question.
Yeah, the caller is just going to retry. He's not going to, the current status is going to be updated when it does the query. So I want them to be very independent paths. So it's not like update is dependent on this. We're going to call them, but the value propagation goes through, entirely comes from the CRI and it gets reflected in the status. Anyways, I think, yeah, to summarize, Derek's, I believe we had this discussion earlier. My memory is kind of fading on this one, but we did add to container status, extended container status, and then not have it in the response. Probably that was an explicit decision. I don't remember. Regarding,
but having it in response actually would be a bit a better idea, because it's exactly the point of runtime which knows which parameters was applied or not. If you try to query it later on, you don't really know is it something, it was any event in between those two calls to CRI.
There shouldn't be, but let me think about that.
I think that's on purpose. It's the same thing that we do for example, creating a container. We have one control loop that tries to take the action to resolve the difference between what we want, which is a container, and what we see, which is presumably no container. And then later on, we have a separate loop for observing the actual set of containers running on the node and updating the status accordingly. So that's currently how the kubelet is architected, and this is just following that pattern.
But, right. But I'm sorry, but why are you assuming that the client is always the kubelet? I mean, we are talking about the generic API that could be used by something else than the kubelet. And I think that we should not assume that. So I think how the kubelet behaves should not be reflected in the design of this API, because that would be an API design mistake.
Isn't CRI kind of closely tied to the kubelet, or is it used outside of kubelet? Is there any other? We did separate out the CRI code out of the kubelet. Yes, we did that earlier. I believe there was some security issue that was driving that decision. But CRI is for the kubelet, isn't it?
It's for the kubelet, but you don't know what other clients to this socket might be. It can be some monitoring things. It can be something else. So it's not exclusively open at socket.
Okay, let me think about it. If it's not returned as of now, it won't block you because you already have the container status extension. So there is a way to get that information. But having this would be a nice to have. Let me think about this and see where it goes. And to summarize, Don, what you mentioned, it does confirm my suspicion. If there's any other new information that, okay, these fields can be 0 in the kernel, please let me know, because as far as my observations goes, when we query memory limit, CPU shares, CPU period, and CPU quota, the CFS CPU parameters, we should never get back 0. So if we do get back 0, we can safely assume that the CRI does not support it. Is that a reasonable conclusion from our discussion?
I think that you can set that as 0, but that will convert rounded to some non-zero value. So it's not crash. In the older kernel, is if you set that to 0, the kernel will crash. If I remember correctly, because I support tons of those product issues in the past. But the latest kernel basically is rounded to some reasonable number, which is minimal. For CPU, is some minimum number. For memory, it is the full MAC, if I remember correctly. All have to round it to some reasonable number. I just want to say, I also want to follow up with what Alexandra mentioned, that some other CRI implementation like Kata. I don't think this feature will be really meaningful for Kata situation. And for me, it is you spun off another VM, like as the pod sandbox and hypervisor or any other hypervisor solution, and it is as the not just hypervisor, because the gvisor actually it is, you can still read off those C group. It's more lightweight, but you spin up the VM. Basically, it is you dedicate that VM for those group of the containers. So here it is more like how you are going to want to have this group of the container as the pod, and how dynamic the share of the resource with other container in that host. So I just limited what I described here for this particular VPA feature. And I think about it is not really useful. It's not that useful to discuss that use cases here. I just want to put something. Of course, the VM, you could have the GNU driver, all those kind of things can dynamically change. But that's a separate topic, because the VPA, it is really dynamic, the real time to update the resource of the running container. But the Kata, you have to involve with other plugin and to dynamically expand or shrink of the VM size, and then internally and shrink or expanded of the container size. So that's the sort of separate topic, I think.
Yes, right. That's in fact a future where we've been trying to solve that, and we're looking at ballooning as one of the potential ways to reclaim unused VM memory and then share it, do a better resource sharing. We don't have a lot of progress on that yet. Hopefully by next KubeCon we might have something. But right now we're just sticking to containers. Kata, as far as I remember, it does a C group mapping, so it's able to change that and read it. It's a lightweight VM, clear VM, but it's able to leverage the C group mounts and then write to the C group and control the increase and decrease the resource allocation for both CPU and memory, if I recall correctly.
So I apologize. We're over time, and I have to join another meeting. I'm happy to stop the recording. I don't know what happens if I hit end here, if everyone gets kicked out, but thanks to those we were able to get through, and for items we didn't get through, we can either cover on Slack or just queue it for next week.
Yeah, sorry it took so long. I'll just summarize my notes and then share it on Slack maybe, and then we can continue the discussion there. Hello?
I think everyone's still here. I think Derek just left.
Okay. I think I'm.
So, yeah, maybe we can ramp up, and then sorry for the Victor. Maybe we have to follow up your testing enhancement next time, and also if you please. If you need some other action item, please send email to the Signal the group.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. We can cover it next time.
Sure. Okay, so thank you everyone, and maybe that's, and we move the rest after to next week. I think the rest need more time discussing. Yeah. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. Don, one question. Currently, like my kept is on the SIG network. Should I move it to the SIG node so you can be the approver, or?
I think it should be okay in that one. Yeah, SIG network.
Then it has to be like a team the approver.
I think the Bowie already on that one, right? So Bowie. So you can put Bowie from the SIG network as the approver, another approver. So we basically can carry on from there.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending today's. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.